Today we are working on Lesson 29, Multi-Step Problems, All Operations. So we're going to look at this first example together and read it, and then talk about some different ways that we can solve it. The school librarian, Mr. Marker, knows the library has 1,400 books. I'm going to go ahead and underline that because I know that's going to be important. But wants to reorganize how the books are displayed on the shelves. Mr. Marker needs to know how many fiction, nonfiction, and resource books are in the library. He knows that the library has 4 times as many fiction books as resource books and half as many nonfiction books as fiction books. If these are the only types of books in the library, how many of each type of book are in the library? So we got a lot of information there. Let's look back at what we need to know. What we know for sure is that there are 1,400 books in the library. We also know the types of books. We know there's fiction, nonfiction, and resource, and that's important. The next part of information that we definitely want to make sure we underline is that he knows that the library has 4 times as many fiction books as resource books, and that it has half as many nonfiction books as fiction books. So all of this information is going to help us figure out how many of each type of book is in the library, which is our question. How many of each type of book are in the library? We always want to make sure we know what question are we answering, because sometimes in these long story problems we can kind of get lost in the information. How many of each type of book? So the first thing it asks us to do is to draw a tape diagram to just represent the total number of books in the library. Well, I know the total number of books in the library is 1,400 books. So just draw a big long tape diagram and put a 1,400 in it. That's pretty simple. That's just showing how many books I know for sure there are. The next question says, draw 2 more tape diagrams, one to represent the number of fiction books in the library and one to represent the number of resource books. Well, when I look up here, I know that it tells me that there are 4 times as many fiction books as resource books and half as many nonfiction books as fiction books. So if I have to do a tape diagram, 1 for the number of fiction books and 1 to represent the number of resource books, my resource books is just going to be one part, okay? One part of the tape diagram is going to be my resource books. And then my fiction books, I know there's 4 times as many fiction books as resource books. So this is going to need to be a tape diagram with 4 sections. So again, 1 section for my resource books, but for my fiction books, it's going to need to be 1, 2, 3, 4 times that many. So it's going to have 4 sections. So I know whatever goes in here, I would have to take that times 4 to find how many fiction books there are. So another question we need to ask is what variable should we use throughout the problem? So obviously we have an unknown. We're not sure how many of each books. So what variable can we use? Well, we're going to use an R to stand for resource books, okay? So that's going to be our variable throughout the problem. That just makes the most sense, because once we find our resource books, we know how many of if we know how many of those, we know that we can multiply by 4 to find how many fiction books, and then, which we'll get to, we know we can also find out from our fiction books how many nonfiction books. So we can use our R for resource books as our variable. So then we're going to come down here and it says, what is the relationship between resource books and fiction books algebraically? So again, if we look back up at our problem says that we know resource books was 1 part of the tape diagram. We have 4 times as many fiction books as resource books, and then half as many nonfiction books as fiction books. So that would be half as many. So this is 4, and I know half of 4 is what? Right, 2. So if we show that algebraically, we say, well, if R equals resource books, then 4R is our fiction books, okay? Because R is resource books. And we can come back up here and put an R. And then 4R is going to be our fiction books. That's how we're going to find that. And then next we'll look at how from this we also find our nonfiction books. So let's turn to the next page. And we see that for our nonfiction books, it's going to be 2 sections of the tape diagram, which is going to be 2R. Because it said in our story problem that the nonfiction books were half what the fiction books were. So if the fiction books were 4, then our nonfiction is going to be 2. Okay, so now what do we do to figure this out? It says, how did you decide how many sections this tape diagram would have? So we're going to explain what we knew, that there are half as many nonfiction books as fiction books, and half of 4 is 2. So that's just what we've been saying as we're looking at our information in our problem, how we knew that our nonfiction book needed to be a tape diagram that had 2 sections. Remember to pause this whenever you need to, if you need to re-listen or if you need to just make sure you have all the information down, because I know this is a long problem. Then it says, represent the number of nonfiction books in the library algebraically. So how do we show this as an algebraic equation and not just a tape diagram? Well, we know that 2R, which is what we just wrote up here, is going to show that because that's half as many as the fiction books, which were 4R. Okay, so it says use the tape diagrams we drew to solve the problem. So this is kind of where we put it all together with the tape diagram. So first we know 1400. 1400 represents how many books are in the library. So that's the first thing that we're going to write. And then we're going to take our resource books, fiction books, and nonfiction books, and we're going to put those together into one long tape diagram because those need to equal 1400. So in this tape diagram, we're going to have an R for resource books. We know that's going to be our smallest. We also know that 4R is our fiction books, and that's going to be our largest. So 4R. And then this over here represents 2R, which will be our nonfiction book. So we know that of those 1400 books, R plus 4R plus 2R should give us this information. Resource books, our 4R is our fiction books, and our 2R is our nonfiction books. So we should be able to find out exactly how many of each of those there are. So it says write an equation to go along with that tape diagram. And this is how we're going to find out what that variable R is going to stand for. So again, we just say 4R plus 2R plus R equals 1400. Just saying that these 3 sections need to equal that 1400. So if we take 4R, 2R, and R together, that's 4, 5, 6, 7. So that means that 7R equals 1400. So if I know that 7R equals 1400, I know that a number and a letter together are multiplication. And I also know that I can divide, which is that inverse operation. So when we show that algebraic equation, it looks like this. 7R divided by 7 equals 1400 divided by 7, okay? Well, I know that when I take a number and divide it by itself, I come back to 1. So 7 divided by 7 is just going to give me 1, which would be 1R. And if I have 1R, I don't have to show that 1. I can just put R equals 1400 divided by 7. This is a problem that you could work out along the side. But something you can also remember is those 2 zeros, you can kind of put those to the side of your brain for a minute and think of 14 divided by 7. Well, I know 14 divided by 7 is 2, which means that 1400 divided by 7 is 200. So that tells me that R equals 200. Well, what does that R mean? What is that telling me? Well, let's think about the reason we chose that variable. That R stands for resource books. So what this means is that there are 200 resource books in the library. So of the 1400, 200 of those are resource books. That's what that R is telling me. So once I know that, I can look back at my tape diagram or look at the variables that I used in my algebraic equation, and I can find how many fiction books and how many nonfiction books. So again, that R means 200 resource books. So if we look at the next part of our lesson, it says how many fiction books are in the library. Well, I know that fiction is 4R, and I now know that my R is 200. That variable, we're replacing that variable with 200. And 4 times 200 is 800. So there are 800 fiction books in the library. I also know how many nonfiction books. I know that my variable for that was 2R. That was my equation. 2 times 200 is 400. So there are 400 nonfiction books. So now of those 1400, I've answered my question, how many fiction books, how many nonfiction books, and how many resource books. of that 1,400. So now the librarian can adjust those the way he would like. Another way that you can do this type of problem is to set up a table that has 4 columns. So we're going to set up a table that has 4 columns, and our titles are going to be that fiction, nonfiction, resource, and total. So the first thing, you can kind of just make a tape diagram for the top of your column. Mine's not going to be very straight, but that's okay. And you want 4 equal columns. So we're making a table. We're going to use this top part. And we're going to have fiction, nonfiction, resource, and total. So fiction, nonfiction, resource, and then total. Okay, also go ahead and make 3 more rows in your table. Again, don't worry about whether they're straight or not. Mine obviously are not. Your headings are fiction, nonfiction, resource, and total. So first we're just going to write in those equations that we found for each one. So our equation for fiction was 4R. Our nonfiction was 2R. R was resource. And then our total was that 7R. Okay, so we're just going to put those in there. So if we add a different amount of books, this equation gives us a way in this table to show how we can figure out how many books might be in the library. So let me explain what I mean. Let's pretend that R was 1. So for this second row, if R was 1, then I would take 4 times 1 and get 4. I would take 2 times 1 and get 2. My total number of resource books would be 1 because R is 1. And my total would be 7. So I'm just saying if R were 1, what would that be? And then it still works the same. Nonfiction is still half of what fiction is. Fiction is still 4 times what resource is. Okay. So then let's say that in this next row that R is worth 5. And I'm going to write that out here. Let's say R equals 5. So now I'm substituting R for 5. So I'm still using the same equation for R. So for fiction, I would say 4 times 5 is 20. For nonfiction, 2 times 5 is 10. Again, for resource, it's just R, so R equals 5. And then I would have to add that total, 20 plus 10 plus 5. And in my total, I would get 35. So again, just practicing substituting numbers in for that R. We're going to add 1 more row at the bottom. Just like we did before. Same headings, obviously. And then this time, we're going to use what we know. So we're going to use our, what we actually found R was worth. So R was worth 200. So again, 4 times that 200 was 800. We had 800 fiction books. 2 times 200 was 400. Our resource books were 200. And then altogether total books were 1,400. So this is just showing that you could also use a table to find your answers and lay it out this way. So again, how many fiction books were in the library? There were 800. It shows us that. How many nonfiction books are in the library? We know if we look, there are 400. How many resource books are in the library? 200. So we're just reading that table. Does the library have 4 times as many fiction books as resource books? So we have to look and see. Does the library have 4 times as many fiction books as resource books? That means if I take 200 times 4, would I get 800? And the answer is yes. Does the library have half as many nonfiction books as fiction books? So I look at nonfiction. Is 400 half of 800? Yes, it is. And then does the library have 1,400 books? When I add 800 plus 400, I have 1,200 plus another 200. And yes, my total is 1,400. So just showing that you can also use a table to find that information. If you've gotten to this point in the lesson, you've finished this first example, raise your hand for Mrs. Corey to see your work. We're going to split this lesson into 2 different lessons. So this is the first part of lesson 29. So when you have finished, raise your hand for Mrs. Corey to see your work.